Welcome to this online lesson. We're going to commence with some do now questions. Don't think about this too much, go with your gut reactions to begin with. What are these footballers doing? Why might they be doing it? Pause the video and note down your answers now. Okay, hopefully the clue is in the picture on the right. These footballers are performing the Nazi salute. So why might they be doing it? Or perhaps they're doing it to show support or respect for Hitler. Perhaps they're doing it because it's the German football team. Well, there's one crucial piece of information I've not given you here. This is the England football team in Germany in 1938. I'm going to zoom in and show you. Can we see the three lions on their white shirts now? Yes, what's going on here is that the England football team playing before World War II has decided that it might be a good idea while the German national anthem is being played to make the Nazi salute like the German players did as well. It's unclear as to whether they were being forced to do this or whether they just thought it was a way of showing respect. After all, World War II had not started yet, and many of these footballers would have been unaware of the horrific crimes of the Nazis. But it also reveals something else. This shows an idea of where people who are scared of a potential enemy might let them get away with things simply to avoid a fight. This is crucial for understanding the origins of World War II, and it's a process known as appeasement. Your lesson title today is Blitzkrieg. How did Germany conquer Europe in less than a year? If you've already done my online lesson looking at German rearmament called Guns Old Butter, we've already done some work on this, but we're going to look more now at tactically what Blitzkrieg was all about and how the Germans fought at the beginning of World War II. The aims are to know how Blitzkrieg worked and to explain Germany's early success in World War II. Also, we'll be evaluating the importance of an important event called the Dunkirk evacuation, sometimes referred to as Operation Dynamo. So pause the video while you're noting down those titles, and then we'll move on. Earlier, I mentioned this key word, appeasement. Note it down. Appeasement is when you're going to give someone what they want so that they will stop asking for anything more or anything worse. As a really simple example of this, you may have noticed that perhaps you've seen a parent with their kid out shopping and the little kid keeps on begging their parent for a treat. And perhaps for a quiet life they give in to them. However, the usual effect of this is rather than shutting up, the kid just asks for more and more and more and more and tries to get away with it. Eventually the parent might blow their top and storm out of the shop telling them off. Well, who's at fault there? Is it the kid or is it the parent for giving in to their demands? Arguably, if the parent had said, no, you're not having those sweets right at the start of the conversation, that would have been it. But by giving in and hoping to have a quiet life by giving the kid what they wanted, they caused a bigger argument. Sure, that's a silly example for a very big idea, but appeasement in world politics works in a similar way. Here we can see in the picture Neville Chamblerlain on the left, who was the British Prime Minister, and we can see Adolf Hitler, the Chancellor of Germany, on the right. Firstly though, record your own definition of appeasement. Done? Okay. I've already made that comparison between a parent buying sweets for a nagging child in the hope that the child will stop asking for anything else. Here, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain tried to use appeasement to stop Adolf Hitler invading countries. In other words, he gave Hitler what he wanted in the short term, hoping to prevent another bigger war. Chamberlain knew that Britain was not ready for war in 1939. It definitely wasn't ready for war in the years previous to it. And so any delay that he could put in place and any way that he could secure power was seen as the best way of stopping a catastrophe happening for Britain. But of course it didn't work. We know that World War II happened. So we're going to see why this policy of appeasement, of giving Hitler what he wanted, was a disastrous failure. Peace in our time. This is a famous quote by British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, said on the day that he was pictured here with a piece of paper at an airport in London. You can just make out his plane in the background and a crowd. That piece of paper was an agreement between the British and the Germans, but what did it say, and did it secure peace for them? In 1938, Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia. This was, of course, a massive crime. Surely this would have been enough for the British to go to war with the Germans, to teach Hitler a lesson. No, actually. The British were too worried. They were not yet ready for a war themselves, and they desperately wanted to avoid the bloodshed that they had suffered in World War I. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain met with Hitler and said that Germany could keep Czechoslovakia, in other words, appeasing Hitler, giving him what he wanted, on the condition that Hitler didn't order any more invasions. We'll see how good Hitler was at keeping his word in a moment. I've put into this, linked into the description of this video, a link to a video which shows Chamberlain reading out this agreement and addressing the crowd behind him. If you were able to access this, how confident does Chamberlain seem? Does he really seem to believe that he's got peace in their time? And how do the crowd seem to react? Are they pleased? Are they worried? Do they believe him? If you're able to access that video, go and watch it now and then answer those two questions. When you've done that, you can proceed with this video. But for now, you can press pause. Well, let's have a look at the big picture of German aggression at this time. That was just one example of an agreement between the British and the Germans. Firstly, we can see that Germany broke the Treaty of Versailles way back in 1936 when they invaded the Rhineland in Germany. Britain does nothing at this point. They could have demanded that the Germans move their troops out of this region and stop threatening the Belgians and the French, but they thought, no, we won't rattle the cage, we'll just let Hitler get away with this and we'll keep an eye on what he's going to do next. What he tended to do next was something a lot bigger. He had seen that he had got away with moving troops into the Rhineland, and he broke the Treaty of Versailles again by uniting with Austria. This was a move known as the Anschluss. Hitler believed that Austrians and Germans were the same people with the same language. After all, let's not forget Hitler himself was an Austrian. Many Austrians supported this unification with Germany, but some did not. Nevertheless, this broke the Treaty of Versailles, and the Allies could have done something about it. They didn't. What next then? Well, this brings us on to September 1938 and the events that we've just looked at with the Peace in Our Time speech. In September of 1938, Chamberlain allowed Hitler to invade the so-called Sudetenland. The Sudetenland is the area in white and grey on Czechoslovakia there. It was a heavily German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain allowed the Nazis to take over the Sudetenland on the condition that they didn't invade all of Czechoslovakia or order any further invasions. Predictably, March 1939 rolls round, Hitler goes back on his word and he invades all of Czechoslovakia. Still, the British and the French do nothing. But they do a small thing. They say to the Germans that if they invade any more countries, that will be it. That will be war between Germany and the Allies. By this point, do you think Hitler was going to believe such a claim? No. September the 1st of 1939, the Germans invaded Poland. Finally, Chamberlain's patience ended and Britain and France declared war on Nazi Germany. The policy of appeasement, of giving Hitler what he wanted in return for no war and a quiet life, was over. Sadly, it was too late for Poland. Despite a brave defence, they were soon overrun, and in a moment we're going to look at just how that happened. Firstly, some tasks based on this information though. Firstly, create a basic timeline or list of dates from 1936 to 1939. Record these key events on your list or timeline. And why do you think Germany was appeased until they invaded Poland? Is it that the British and the French were scared because they weren't ready for war themselves? Or is it simply that they feared another war because one had happened so recently? We're talking about World War I there. Also, a word of advice with your timelines. Make sure that it is big and long enough that you can fit 2 detailed events per year. Because if you look on the map here, we've got quite a few events that we need to fit in, and a couple of them are within the same year. Alright, while you complete those tasks, you can pause the video. Press play when you're ready to move on. Clearly, the policy of appeasement didn't work. Less than 1 year later, after Neville Chamberlain had declared peace in our time, Germany invaded Poland and Britain and France declared war on Germany. So why do you think that Chamberlain was so sure that he had stopped Hitler? There's no real wrong answer to this, and I ask it more rhetorically than anything else, and perhaps we'll never truly know. What does seem certain, though, is that Chamberlain truly believed that appeasement would work. He was prepared to sacrifice these other nations in return for preventing a much wider and more destructive war. Chamberlain has had plenty of criticism for this since. However, it's difficult to know whether entering a war with Germany earlier would have been any better, After all, the British and the French were not ready to fight a war yet. It's one of those historical events where, you know what, there are different opinions, they've all got different validities, and you've got to decide which one you agree with. September the 3rd, 1939, 2 days after the German invasion of Poland. British living rooms were filled with anxious people awaiting news from British Prime Minister Neville Chamblerlain. They knew that the British government had sent an ultimatum to the German government saying that if the Germans did not withdraw their army from Poland by 11 o'clock on September the 3rd, 1939, then Britain and France would be declaring war on Germany. An ultimatum is where you make a demand of someone, and if they don't get back to you about that demand within a certain time frame and by a deadline, then it will be assumed that they disagree, and then you follow through with your acts. In this case, a declaration of war. Crowded around their radios, the news that these people had been dreading finally arrived. That Britain and France were going to war with Germany for the second time in less than 20 years. Some tasks for you. What do you think the reaction would have been to this news in Britain? Chamblerlain said, "I do not believe that there is anything more or anything different that I could have done." Given what we have seen in this lesson so far, do you agree? Explain what you think. What I'm basically asking here is, do you think that there is anything different that Chamblerlain could have done apart from his appeasement policy? Or do you think that appeasement was the most realistic policy and course of action open to Chamblerlain? There's no wrong answer here, but just try and back up what you think. I'm going to play for you now the actual audio of Neville Chamberlain's announcement that the war was beginning. Yes, it's a little bit crackly and old-fashioned, but this is pretty much what people would have heard in their living rooms at the time. I think you can really hear the regret and the emotion in Chamblerlain's voice. It lasts about 2.5 minutes, so you can complete your answers while you listen to that. If you need any more time at the end, just pause the video, or we'll carry on.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany. You can imagine what a bitter blow it is to me that all my long struggle to win peace has failed. Yet I cannot believe that there is anything more or anything different that I could have done and that would have been more successful. Up to the very last, it would have been quite possible to have arranged a peaceful and honorable settlement between Germany and Poland. But Hitler would not have it. He had evidently made up his mind to attack Poland whatever happened. And although he now says he put forward reasonable proposals which were rejected by the Poles, that is not a true statement. The proposals were never shown to the Poles, nor to us. And though they were announced in the German broadcast on Thursday night, Hitler did not wait to hear comments on them, but ordered his troops to cross the Polish frontier the next morning. His action shows convincingly that there is no chance of expecting that this man will ever give up his practice of using force to gain his will. He can only be stopped by force. And we and France are today, in fulfillment of our obligations, going to the aid of Poland, who is so bravely resisting this wicked and unprovoked attack upon her people. We have a clear conscience. We have done all that any country could do to establish peace. But a situation in which no word given by Germany's ruler could be trusted, and no people or country could feel itself safe, had become intolerable. And now that we have resolved to finish it, I know that you will all play your part with calmness and courage.
2 days later, on September the 4th, 1939, 2 days after the German invasion of Poland, the British government had sent an ultimatum to the German government saying that if the Germans did not withdraw their army from Poland by 11 o'clock on September the 3rd, 1939, then Britain and France would be declaring war on Germany. think we can all hear the emotion in Chamberlain's voice there. When he says, consequently, this country is at war with Germany, you can almost see him swallowing very hard to make sure that he doesn't cry on the next line. After all, he had devoted the previous few years desperately trying to avoid war with Germany, and he had just failed, and he knew what that would mean for so many British lives. Whatever you think of Chamberlain's appeasement policy, I think we can all agree that that's very sad. We're now going to have a look at the tactics that the Germans employed in order to overwhelm countries like Poland, and then later France and its British allies in France and other countries too. This was known as Blitzkrieg. This is a term coined by the Germans, and it literally means lightning war. Think about lightning. It is fast, violent and unexpected, and that's very much how this system of war works. Some years ago I drew this diagram to represent what Blitzkrieg would have looked like. Not in terms of literally this is how it would have looked, although I've tried to make the military equipment reasonably accurate, but just to sum up how this system worked. These labels will help explain this diagram. Juncker's Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers disrupted reinforcements by destroying bridges and communications. That means that any organised defence becomes so much more difficult because nobody really knows what's going on. The Stukas were like aerial artillery, incredibly accurate, but also terrifying. You may have seen planes diving in films making a screaming noise as they dive. Actually, no plane makes that noise except for the Stuka. It was fitted with a terrifying siren just to frighten people on the ground. Also, fighter planes destroyed enemy planes in the air. That meant that if the Air Force tried to defeat the Germans who were invading, they would be shot down before they could do so. But very often, these planes didn't even make it into the air, because level-flying bombers were tasked with the task of destroying planes and buildings on the ground too. Not only that, infantry who were carried on motorbikes and trucks took targets like important towns very quickly. This meant that the ground was gathered at a much faster pace than troops marching down the road. They could be carried in motorised vehicles. Infantry and foot soldiers were able to follow behind the tanks too. So while the tanks would have to deal with the brunt of the heavy fighting at the frontier and with the enemy, the troops would be better protected. And the Germans didn't just use a few tanks. The British at this time, for example, tended to use 1 or 2 tanks with each section of their soldiers. The Germans had a completely different way of doing this. They would send the tanks in on their own, which could be risky, but it meant that by massing all of your tanks into one concentrated area, the enemy in that area could be overwhelmed and they would simply be able to punch through. Lastly, that results in enemies being overwhelmed quickly. Many surrender with little or no fight because they're so shocked. I want you to imagine it this way. Imagine if I threw a tennis ball to you. Imagine if I gave you plenty of warning and just gently lobbed it towards you. Chances are you'd probably catch it. What about if I threw that tennis ball at you quickly without giving you any warning? You might still catch it, but it would be more difficult. What about if I threw 5 tennis balls at you quickly and without warning? You would panic. You would shrink back and you'd try and defend yourself by fending off the balls, but you wouldn't catch them. This is kind of like how Blitzkrieg worked. Even if one part of this plan was defeated, all the other plans would still be happening, because it wasn't just that this was a process. All of this would be going on at the same time, repeatedly. So that sense of shock that you might get if I threw a bunch of tennis balls at your head, well, multiply that by thousands of times. Because these are soldiers who would have been fearing for their lives, they would have been confused, and they would have been being attacked without warning. It's not a question of cowardice that they surrendered, they were simply overwhelmed and couldn't react. If you're able to get your own copy of this diagram, and you might not be able to, then you can label it. Alternatively, you can create your own copy of the diagram. It doesn't have to be drawn as accurately as mine is. So, task number 1, create your own version of this diagram showing the features of Blitzkrieg. Explain what made Blitzkrieg so difficult to defend against. We're going to use point example explain to do this, and I've included a writing frame there if you need it. If you'd prefer to see the labels and be able to see the picture again, just flip back in the video a few seconds so that blue box has disappeared. If not, pause it here and read those instructions and complete the tasks. It might take you anything up to half an hour to do this if you're doing a really nice detailed drawing, but at the very least, get all of those details down so that you have an understanding of how Blitzkrieg worked. Oh, and check out the spelling of Blitzkrieg. It's a German word, so be a bit careful with it. Pause the video while you complete this task. So hopefully we've understood how all of these different things using tanks, motorised troops, heavily armed infantry and air forces at the same time combine to shock the enemy into surrender. A reminder of how effective this was. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and then in 1940 they invaded the Netherlands, Belgium and France, Denmark and Norway. This meant that German possessions between 1939 and 1940 went from this to this. Clearly, Blitzkrieg worked incredibly well. So how effective was Blitzkrieg? Poland was invaded on September the 1st of 1939, and Poland surrendered on October the 6th, just over a month later. To the surprise of many, Hitler and Stalin, who was the leader of Russia, had signed an agreement not to attack each other. Far from it. Defeated Poland was shared in half between Nazi Germany and Communist Russia. We're going to have an interview now with a German soldier who took part in the invasion of Poland. Unfortunately, there are very few veterans left from the war now that I could really interrogate, and also even fewer that can speak English if they were from the German side. Luckily, I've got a time machine which allows me to bring someone back from the past and translate what they're saying. It's not the best time machine in the world though. Unfortunately, they often sound a little bit like me doing a really bad impression of a German person. But never mind that, we're going to interview them nonetheless. This man is known as Franz Baker. He was a real person, by the way, who I've researched, and so I'll be able to give you some real answers about his life. He was a tank commander in the invasion of Poland in 1939. He also took part in the invasions of France and Russia later, but we're going to concentrate on his experiences in Poland first of all. Your task will be to note down at least 3 facts based upon the interview. You can pause the interview at any time to note down a fact that you find particularly interesting or important. Secondly, from this information, was Blitzkrieg easy for the Germans? Explain your view. Okay, let's bring Franz into the room. Lieutenant Franz Baker, thanks for joining us today. We're here to ask you a few questions about your participation in the Blitzkrieg invasion of Poland. Could you tell us first of all, were you involved in the invasion on the 1st of September? Yeah, I was involved in the initial invasion of Poland. We had been expecting this attack for some time, and yet it still all came as something of a rush, and clearly it was a surprise to the Poles. I remember on the night before September the 1st, we were massed with our tanks just the other side of the Polish border. We thought that surely the Poles must know that we were coming, but apparently they did not. The first thing that I remember at dawn the next day was our artillery guns, these large cannons that fire explosive shells, opened fire on the Polish front line. This must have been a huge shock to them. I leapt into my tank, and we formed, you might say, an armoured spearhead towards the Polish lines, and we encountered very little resistance to begin with. Okay, what can you tell us about your tank, and what sort of fighting were you being expected to do? So, we didn't really know what to expect beforehand. My initial training on the tanks were what we Germans call panzers. We had initially trained on cars with kind of a pretend tank put on the top of it because we weren't allowed to build tanks early on. This actually meant that Germany did not have enough tanks to invade Poland right at the start. So the tank that I was given was a captured Czechoslovakian tank that we had got in 1938-1939. It was known as the Panzer 35T. There's a picture of it on your screen now. Anyway, we headed across the line, and I knew that my tank was actually not as powerful as you might think. Most anti-tank guns would be able to pierce the front armour of my tank and kill all of us inside. So I was not confident. I was, if anything, very frightened as we went into attack. But clearly you survived that attack. So how did you manage that? Well, a lot of it is to do with the fact that the Poles were not ready for us when they invaded. So we had hundreds of tanks attacking in the same place, and the Poles were simply overwhelmed. The next day, after a day of trying to advance and trying to have our troops catch up to us in their trucks and trying to secure enough fuel and ammunition for our tanks, we were told to keep pushing on. By this point, my men and I, we had not slept for the best part of 2.5 days, so we were feeling exhausted. Perhaps that contributes to this feeling that I was seeing things within a few days of the invasion starting. What do you mean that you were seeing things? What sort of things were you seeing? Were they real or were you hallucinating? No, they were real, but we weren't particularly sure to begin with. First of all, we were taking land at a great deal of rate, which seemed in itself to be almost unbelievable, and it was tremendously exciting. But there was at one point I saw a group of Polish cavalrymen charging towards us, and oh right, I've heard about this. So this is where the Poles used horses against your tanks. No, this is actually a disrespectful myth about the Polish military. They were not idiots. You cannot put a tank against a horse and call it a fair fight. No, these cavalry, they would gallop their horses to a position, leap off, and they would use anti-tank rifles against us. The next thing that we knew, the anti-tank bullets were bouncing off the armor, and we had to take them down. In that respect, it was not really a fair fight. But again, like I say, we were becoming terrified and we were becoming exhausted. But our commanders told us to keep pushing on. So would you say that you were pleased with this success, or were you worried? Were you nervous? Look, anyone who fights a war and tells you that he was not scared is a liar. You cannot trust a man like that. Of course we were scared. We were exhausted. We were terrified. And the Poles, well, their equipment was not as good as us. They did not have so many soldiers, and they did not have our air cover. The Luftwaffe, with their Stuka dive bombers and our Messerschmitt fighters, were able to clear the skies of the Polish Air Force, making our job a lot easier than it might otherwise have been. However, we found with each time we advanced, we took more and more land. But we also became more and more exhausted, and we felt more and more nervous that our supplies like fuel and food would not reach us on time. And finally, as we were approaching the outskirts of the Polish city of Warsaw, we heard that the Polish government had surrendered not only to us, but from the Russians who were attacking from the east. And this must have been in early October. I forget the date exactly. It was October the 6th. October the 6th, yeah. And well, we were exhilarated. We had won our first great victory. But it was not straightforward. I do not want anyone to have the impressions that the Poles did not put up any resistance. This is not true. It's just that they did not have any answer to our Blitzkrieg tactics, and we were able to, shall we say, repeat this against the other allies in France later on. Thank you, Franz Baker. I should point out, but obviously as a British person, I'm very much hoping that Germany will not win the war. However, for my part, I hope that you at least survive it. So, good luck. And I'm sorry that our countries have to be at war together. Yeah, I understand that. Good luck, Tommy. That is a German nickname for you Britishers. Okay, thank you. Well, he's back at the time machine now, so that's your chance to write down your 3 interesting facts, and from that information decide whether or not Blitzkrieg sounded easy for the Germans and explain your point of view. Pause the video while you do this. Blitzkrieg wasn't easy, but it did work. It was now time for the Germans to try and repeat this success in the West. What Britain and France did not know about the Polish invasion was that they were next. Remember how Germany attacked France in World War I? They went around France's main defences. Surely they wouldn't try this same trick again. Well, actually they were. The Germans attacked on May the 10th, 1940. By coincidence, this is also the date that Winston Churchill replaced Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Your task is to describe in a few sentences when, where and how Germany managed to attack France. I'm going to demonstrate this to you on the map. First of all, those 2 Vickers light tanks represent the British Expeditionary Force. This is the British professional army that is sent to emergencies to deal with Britain's enemies, in this case Germany. The French Maginot Line was an unbeatable defensive line that went right along the French border with Germany. This had been built for many years and was truly incredible, with underground railways to supply ammunition and troops and all sorts. If the Germans were to attack that head on, they were likely to lose. There's one problem with fixed defences like this though. They can't move. So if you can go around, you can win. The French are confident though. In this region marked on the map now, there is a region called the Ardennes Forest. The forest has got very few good roads going through it, lots of rivers, lots of steep hills. Basically, it was felt that this was impossible terrain for tanks of the time to get through. This was a massive underestimation of how good the German tanks were by 1940. The Germans first attacked the Netherlands and Belgium, very much like they had done in World War I, except in World War I they just attacked Belgium. They also used massive air forces to overpower the Dutch people and the Belgians. The British Expeditionary Force, supporting the French in the Maginot Line, took the bait and moved in. But can we see where there's a gap? The Ardennes Forest. The gamble was that this would be very lightly defended because German tanks couldn't get through there. Well, German tanks got through there. You can probably see what's happening now. German tanks are able to encircle the British and the French, cut them off from each other, and the British are now absolutely stuck. They have little choice but to retreat back to Dunkirk, where they can either be defeated or they can try and escape. More on that in a moment, but for now pause the video and describe in a few sentences when, where and how Germany attacked France. Pause the video while you complete that. Let's have a look at the situation that the Allies were in by the end of May 1940. The retreat to Dunkirk. This is shown in the map at the top there. We can see that the British, with a few French allies, although by this point they were being increasingly separated from each other, were massed along the coast of France and Belgium here, all converging on the port city of Dunkirk. The Germans were expanding their territory to the south, to the west and to the east. They were surrounded on three sides by the Germans and one side by the sea. So let's have a look at the situation. The British Expeditionary Force really was in deep trouble. It was low on tanks, air support and bullets. It was surrounded on three sides by German tanks with very few of its own, and on one side by the sea. The Luftwaffe, that's the German Air Force, was attacking soldiers on the beach and the ships trying to rescue them. Your task. What seems to be the best option for the British trapped at Dunkirk? Stand and fight? Try and break out and link up with the French? Or attempt to evacuate, even though there were not enough ships? Whatever you choose, you must explain your choice. If you want to get a further insight into this, I've included as a link in the description a clip from the film Dunkirk, which was produced a few years ago, which shows the experience of some of the soldiers on the beach under an air attack. It might give you a sense of just how kind of exposed and how vulnerable these soldiers were to air attack. By all means, watch that if you think it'll improve your answer, but also pause the video here and complete that task. Pause now. Well, the only real option that the British had was to try and attempt an evacuation. Nobody was particularly optimistic about this, though. It was thought that maybe 30,000 men would be rescued. Winston Churchill said after this event, which is sometimes referred to as Operation Dynamo, "Wars are not won by evacuations." And he's right, they're not. However, you do lose a war if you fail with an evacuation and lose your army. Dunkirk was considered a miracle by the British. Not only did Hitler order his tanks to stop, but the RAF just managed to keep enough German aircraft away for an evacuation to be attempted. Interestingly, no one's really sure why the Germans were ordered to stop their tanks. It's possible that Hitler was hoping that the British might try and sue for peace to try and get out of what situation they were in, but it turned out to be a massive blunder by the Germans. As for the RAF keeping the planes away, well, it was little comfort to the men on the beaches. They didn't see very many British aircraft and assumed that the RAF weren't there. The truth is, the planes that they saw were the ones that got through the fighter protection that was further inland. This was a big fight. The Navy, the Army and the Air Force were all involved working together. Here's some further pictures. On the left we can see a British destroyer, which is a type of small warship, which is covered with hundreds of British soldiers that have been saved from the beaches of Dunkirk. Notice that they aren't carrying any weapons. They've been left behind. On the right we can see a scene on the beach, where you can see bombs going off in the background, smoke from the fires that have been set in the town, and we can see these tiny little boats being tied together to allow the British to climb onto a slightly bigger ship. Hundreds of little ships, these were civilian boats of all sizes, sometimes with a civilian crew, came to the rescue of the British Expeditionary Force and working alongside the Navy. There's a bit of a myth that these little boats carried the men right the way back to England, and it's for the most part not really true. Instead, these little boats would get right up close to the beach where it was shallow, pick up the men and shuttle them out to the larger ships out to sea, and repeat that process until the big ships were full. Even the weather was kind. There was fog on several days in late May, hiding the evacuation from the prying eyes of the German Air Force for long enough to get over 300,000 men safely back to Britain, most of them from the British and Empire forces and a few from the French too. So clearly this was a big success. But it's not a complete success. We shouldn't try and paint Dunkirk as a victory. It was anything but perhaps we can try and say it was a successful failure. Here's what I mean. So this is what might have happened if Dunkirk had been a failure. The best part of Britain's army would have been killed or captured by the Germans. This didn't happen because Dunkirk worked out. Britain would probably have had to have made peace with Hitler, which doesn't bear thinking about. And Germany would have found it much easier to invade Britain if they wanted to. Lastly, World War II may have been lost by Britain before it really got going. Luckily, none of those things happened, but it gives us an idea of why Dunkirk's important, because none of those things did happen. On the other hand, what happened because Dunkirk was a success? Though most of their equipment was lost, 300,000 British and French troops lived to fight another day. Britain was able to continue the fight against Hitler alone in Europe. That's just not to say that Britain was entirely alone. Britain had a big empire to draw upon, and soldiers from all over the empire contributed. But it did mean that Britain was the last enemy in Europe itself ready to fight the Germans at that point. The RAF was able to win the Battle of Britain, which we'll look at in a future lesson, so the German invasion never happened. And the British people under the new Prime Minister Winston Churchill celebrated Dunkirk and were less likely to give up. Because Britain stayed in the war and later got other allies and friends to join them, Germany eventually lost the war, although not for another 5 years. Your task then, and this will take some thought because what we're talking about here is the importance of an event based upon what might have happened if it had gone wrong and based upon what did happen because it went right. Read the info in the table carefully. Explain one way that Dunkirk was a success for the British. But then think harder. Explain one way that Dunkirk was also a failure. Don't take those from the left column there. That explains what would have happened if Dunkirk had been a failure. Instead, look for information that suggests that the British were still in a pretty weak position. Thirdly, consider how important each fact is. Was Dunkirk more of a success or more of a failure for the British? Explain your answer using this writing frame if you need it. I think Dunkirk was more of a success or more of a failure for the British. Choose which. An example that supports my view is, and this supports my opinion because. Okay, pause the video here while you complete that task and press play when you're ready to conclude. Here's where we'll finish. We need to understand that Blitzkrieg completely defeated the British Expeditionary Force, but the British Expeditionary Force had escaped. The British Army had left most of its heavy weapons in France, but it was saved and Britain was protected by the sea and might later be able to rebuild those weapons and re-equip its army, but that would take time. The German army had conquered most of Europe, but it couldn't invade Britain yet. What Churchill said to Parliament at the end of this, and he said this in a much longer speech, is, "The Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin." Your last two questions then. Firstly, how dangerous do you think Britain's position was in June 1940 after the evacuation from Dunkirk? Review those bullet points to help you out. Then secondly, how might the Battle of Britain be fought? After all, the British army was without its weapons, and the German army couldn't get to Britain because the English Channel was in the way. Here's a potential clue. But that'll be a spoiler for next lesson. So pause the video while you complete those tasks, but after that, that will be the end of this lesson. Thanks very much for watching. I hope it's been useful and interesting, and if it has, give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. All the best, and thank you. I'll see you again for another lesson soon. Goodbye.